The Cyclops sequence has always been one of the most terrifying chapters in Homer's The Odyssey, a moment where myth, brutality, and raw survival collide. And now with director Christopher Nolan adapting the story for the big screen, that ancient horror is being reshaped through IMAX lenses, practical scale, and a filmmaking style built on tension and immersion. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing how Christopher Nolan might craft the Cyclops scene, drawing from the new trailer footage, the original text by Homer, and the cinematic techniques that may turn this encounter into one of the most unforgettable moments in the film. There will be spoilers from the Cyclops moments in Homer's The Odyssey, so if you haven't read the epic poem, then I'd recommend watching one of my other videos on the film instead. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my content surrounding Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey movie, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive into how Christopher Nolan might approach the Cyclops scene in The Odyssey. So from the moment the new trailer cuts to that first glimpse of the Cyclops, you can feel Nolan signalling that this sequence is going to be one of the film's major tonal pivots, showcasing an eruption of mythic horror inside a story already defined by danger and disorientation. The cave shots of the Cyclops sequence alone tell us far more than they initially seem to. In the shots of Odysseus and his men entering the cave, the lighting is low, with illumination only coming from shafts of natural light. It creates this oppressive, suffocating atmosphere where the men are barely visible. And then in the background, you see just enough movement to register that something enormous is shifting in the darkness towards them. Nolan is clearly leaning into tension through absence, and the Cyclops seems to be introduced more as a presence felt, one that can be now captured on massive IMAX screens and felt in ways through immersive sound. Visually, you see the hand grabbing the wall of the cave, and then shots of Odysseus and his men looking up at the monster once he gets closer. We then get the full reveal of Bill Irwin playing the Cyclops, which was confirmed in Nolan's released interview for Time magazine this week. He moves towards the screen while holding one of Odysseus's men, showing us just how huge he is going to be in the film. And then at the very end of the new trailer, there's the shot of the Cyclops pulling one of Odysseus's men away, presumably eating him off screen. What's striking in all of this footage is how grounded the cave environment looks and how Nolan seems to be playing with shadows. It's a real claustrophobic feeling cave, a reminder that in Homer's text, the Cyclops is a force of nature and a living embodiment of both isolation and brutality. But another shot that can be labelled as equally intriguing might be the one of the Cyclops outside the cave, appearing to walk through a cluster of trees. In this shot, Nolan shows him moving through a wooded area and brushing aside trees, and I think this moment is the one where the Cyclops is on his way to the cave where Odysseus and his men already reside. Considering that they have used a practical animatronic and puppet for the Cyclops scenes, it's interesting to think about how they might pull a moment like this off, especially a version of the creature that is also shot outside and making that feel seamless on screen. Now, I will say that I wasn't blown away by that particular shot in the trailer, but I'm hoping that in the movie, Nolan can make it feel grand and look as great as the other shots of the Cyclops. Taken together though, I think all of the Cyclops shots suggest that Nolan is building tension through perspective and scale, letting the audience experience the Cyclops the way Odysseus and his men do. The cave footage suggests a slow, suffocating build-up where the men are trapped in a space that offers no escape. And the creature's design, glimpsed only in fragments, tells us that Nolan is leaning into the horror of the myth rather than sanitizing it. It all points to a sequence that will likely be one of the film's most intense and memorable set pieces, with Nolan seeming to be using the IMAX film format for a bigger sense of dread, letting the scale of the creature overwhelm the frame, the darkness swallow the characters, and the environment feel hostile. Coming to the original Cyclops moment in Homer's The Odyssey, I think it's important to detail this a bit more before we discuss how Nolan might adapt it. The Cyclops sequence in Homer's poem is one of the most vivid, brutal, and psychologically charged moments in the entire epic, and when you break it down beat by beat, you realise just how much cinematic potential it already contains. The sequence begins long before the monster appears, with Odysseus and his men arriving on an island that feels strangely untouched, almost unnervingly quiet. Homer describes it as a place rich with resources of lush pastures, wild goats, fresh water, but also a place that seems to exist outside the normal rhythms of civilization. There are no cities, no laws, no signs of organized life. Odysseus, who's driven by curiosity and the desire for hospitality, a sacred expectation in Greek culture, decides to explore it further. He brings a small group of men and a skin of strong wine, not knowing that this decision will lead them into one of the darkest encounters of their entire journey. And when they reach the cave, the tone shifts immediately. Homer describes it as enormous, filled with livestock, tools, and baskets of cheese. It's a domestic space, but one that feels too large, too crude, and too isolated. Odysseus' men want to steal what they can and leave, but Odysseus insists on staying, hoping to meet the cave's owner and receive gifts. And this is the moment where the tension begins to coil. The cave becomes a trap the moment they step inside, and Homer makes that clear by describing the massive boulder that serves as the door. When the Cyclops finally arrives, driving his flock into the cave, the men realize just how hopeless their situation is. The door boulder is so large that not even 20 teams of oxen could move it. And in that instant, they understand that they are sealed inside with something far beyond human. The first appearance of Polyphemus is then one of the most chilling introductions in ancient literature. Homer doesn't describe him as a mythical creature with grandeur, he describes him as a brute, a being who lives without laws, without community, and without restraint. His single eye is not a symbol of wisdom, but a symbol of deformity, a physical manifestation of his moral and social isolation. When he discovers the men, he doesn't react with curiosity or hospitality, but with suspicion and violence. He demands to know who they are, and when Odysseus answers, Polyphemus responds by grabbing 2 of his men, smashing them against the ground, and then eating them. This moment is pure horror, being sudden, visceral, and without mercy. It's the kind of brutality that strips away any illusion of safety, as the men are trapped in a confined space with a creature who sees them not as guests, not as enemies, but as food. And then the next part of this sequence is a masterclass in tension and psychological warfare. Odysseus knows that killing the Cyclops outright is impossible, not because they lack the strength, but because they would never be able to move the boulder blocking the exit. So he has to think, to strategize, and to manipulate. And this is where the famous nobody line of the trick begins. Odysseus offers Polyphemus the strong wine he brought from the ship, a wine so potent it must be diluted with water to be drinkable. And so Polyphemus, unused to such richness, drinks greedily and becomes drunk. In his stupor, he asks Odysseus for his name, and Odysseus replies that his name is Nobody. It's a moment that blends cunning with dark humour, but it also sets up one of the most terrifying scenes in the entire poem. Once the Cyclops collapse into drunken sleep, Odysseus and his men heat the sharpened stake they carved from a massive piece of wood. And when they drive it into Polyphemus' single eye, the cave then erupts into chaos. The Cyclops roars, thrashes, and tears at the stake, and the sound is so loud that the other Cyclopses on the island come running. But when they ask who is hurting Polyphemus, he screams, "Nobody is attacking me," and therefore they leave, thinking that he has been struck by a divine illness. The escape that follows is equally tense. Polyphemus sits at the entrance of the cave, feeling the backs of his sheep as they leave, hoping to catch the men as they attempt to flee. Odysseus, thinking several steps ahead, ties his men beneath the bellies of 3 sheep each, clinging to the wall as the animals shuffle past the blinded giant. It's a moment of pure suspense in the poem, and during all of this, Odysseus is pressed against the underside of the largest ram. And in response, Polyphemus laments his pain and curses the stranger who deceived him. So there's a strangely human moment amongst everything that happens, one that adds more depth to the Cyclops. But when the remaining men finally escape the cave, they race back to their ship with the stolen livestock, and Odysseus makes the fateful decision to reveal his true name, shouting back at the blinded Cyclops. It's a moment of pride, ego, and defiance, but it also has devastating consequences. In knowing this, Polyphemus calls upon his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus, asking that he never return home, or if he must, that he return alone, broken, and delayed. This curse becomes one of the driving forces of the entire epic, a turning point that shapes the rest of Odysseus' journey. As a whole, the Cyclops sequence is a perfect blend of suspense, brutality, strategy, and mythic weight. It moves from curiosity to dread, from entrapment to violence, from cunning to escape, and finally to divine retribution. Every beat is cinematic, every moment throughout is charged with tension, and every detail, from the cave's oppressive darkness to the monstrous appetite of Polyphemus, feels tailor-made for a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan, who thrives on claustrophobic environments, moral complexity, and the slow tightening of narrative pressure. So when you look at the new trailer footage and combine it with Nolan's established filmmaking style, it becomes clear that his Cyclops sequence has the potential to be one of the most visually aggressive and psychologically suffocating moments in the entire film. Nolan has been drawn to environments that trap characters, and the Cyclops cave gives him the perfect opportunity to push that instinct into outright horror. The cave shots in the trailer already hint at this, as the way it's been lit makes the cave feel smaller and more oppressive. It was also mentioned in Nolan's interview with Time magazine that the way lighting is used would be a defining factor of the scene. So I think that Nolan is using the environment as a weapon here, letting the darkness swallow the characters until the Cyclops becomes a shape that emerges. This is an example of classic horror blocking, with the monster always partially obscured, always larger than the frame can comfortably contain, and always positioned so that the audience sees it a split second after the characters do. And the Cyclops design also helps reinforce this approach. From the glimpses of the Cyclops in the trailer, Nolan's version is grotesque, asymmetrical, and disturbingly human in its deformity. It's not a clean and polished CGI creature, it looks tactile, heavy and scarred, as if it has lived a life of violence and isolation. I think Nolan seems to be leaning into the idea that the Cyclops is not just a mythical being, but a physical presence that dominates the space around it. In the cave, I think he will likely keep the creature in partial shadow, revealing only fragments at certain moments, whether that be a shoulder, a hand, or the glint of a single eye. And then when we get a full look at it, it will be much more effective. This aligns perfectly with the horror tradition of showing less to create more fear. And because Nolan shoots on IMAX 70mm film, every detail can be magnified to an almost uncomfortable degree. When it comes to the horror itself, Nolan could also certainly lean into sound design. The Cyclops breathing, the scraping of its feet against the stone, or the rumble of its voice echoing throughout the cave. These elements and examples could create a sensory effect that makes the audience feel trapped alongside the characters. Nolan and his composers have always used sound as a psychological tool, and here it could be used to make the Cyclops feel omnipresent. So even when the creature isn't visible, its presence will be felt through the acoustics of the cave. Moving on, when it comes to the nobody trick of that scene, I think this will almost certainly remain in the film as it's too iconic to remove, and then the escape using the sheep could be filmed as a long tense sequence with the camera pressed closer to the ground, following Odysseus and his men as they cling to the animals. And then when Odysseus reveals his name to the Cyclops from the ship, Nolan may choose to be faithful to Homer's text, framing this as a tragic flaw. It unleashes Poseidon's wrath and sets the rest of the story in motion. In the new Time interview, Nolan said that he considered casting actors to play the gods, but settled on something more primal. He said, "I became more interested in the idea that to people in that period, evidence of gods was everywhere. In Bronze Age Greek, thunder, rain, and the sun rising didn't have specific explanations, they represented the will of the immortals. The wonderful thing about cinema, and IMAX in particular, is that you can take an audience to a place of immersion, feeling close to events like storms, turbulent seas, and high winds. You want the audience to be on the boat with them, fearing the ocean, fearing the wrath of Poseidon, the way the characters do. That to me is so much more powerful than any individual image you can have of a god. So I think in regarding the effects of Poseidon, we will see that in the scenes that follow with Odysseus and his men on their boat. Ultimately, I think Nolan's adaptation of the Cyclops scene will be defined by many contrasts. It will be defined by light and shadow, of silence and violence, and of scale and confinement. I think he will treat the Cyclops not as a fantasy creature, but as a horror antagonist, an unstoppable force that dominates the frame and reshapes the environment around it. The IMAX format will make the experience visceral, overwhelming, and deeply physical, and by blending the structure of Homer's poem with his own cinematic instincts, Nolan could transform one of the most famous moments in ancient literature into a sequence that feels both timeless and terrifying. But that was my video discussing how Christopher Nolan might approach the Cyclops scene in The Odyssey. Are you excited to see this scene in Nolan's adaptation? And based on what we've seen in all the trailers and footage, how do you think the filmmaker will go about bringing it to life in the film? I'm interested to hear what you guys think, so let me know down below in the comment section. For much more videos and breakdowns, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.